The movie begins in Buffalo, New York. There we see Dan. Dan is a sales expert because he understands the buyer's mentality, which leads him to become the unrivaled salesman of the month. One day, Dan leaves early due to his marriage anniversary. In a little while, Dan reaches his home. We see Dan's wife, Jessica. Dan has 3 children. His eldest daughter is Nina, the son is named Kyle, and the youngest child is Max. Jessica is quarreling with Nina to focus on her studies and not follow her boyfriend. Dan tries to talk to Nina, but she doesn't listen to him. Dan is sick of this family drama, so he plans to go out tonight with Jessica. Kyle reaches his friend's house, where we get to know that Kyle is a popular online gamer. In the park, Jessica and Dan make out, but a group of boys tries to bully them by recording them. Jessica somehow takes Dan back home. Later, Jessica punches her friend Gwen while boxing. Jessica apologizes to Gwen and tells her about the problems she's going through that caused her to crash out while practicing. Gwen assures her that everything will be all right and also gives her a business card, telling her that she's a travel agent. After this, we see Dan with Max in a supermarket where a person attacks them. Dan defends himself, and while fighting, we notice that Dan is not an ordinary person, as he used to be an assassin in his past. Dan easily defeats the attacker. After reaching home, Dan realizes that his enemies have gotten his information. He takes his weapons and arrives at Nina's college, where he's told that Nina is bunking college. He then goes to Nina and gets angry at her. Nina tells him that she's fed up and no one listens to her. After which, Dan reaches Samir's house to take Kyle, but after reaching there, he gets angrier, knowing that Kyle was lying to him about studies. Dan then leaves that place and reaches Jessica with all of his children. Jessica works in a hospital. Dan tells Jessica that she's always complaining, so today he's taking his family on a vacation to Las Vegas. After which they leave, and a car starts stalking them. Dan reaches a workshop and removes the tracking device from his car, after which he leaves again. On his way, he notices everyone busy on their phones, understanding that they can be tracked, so he snatches everyone's phone and throws them out of the car while reminding everyone that they won't use the phone on this whole journey. After a little while, they stop at a shop to buy a map. When Dan tries to pay in cash, the shopkeeper gets suspicious. But Dan refuses to do so and pays with extra cash instead. After which, they start traveling again, and now, for not having their phones, they start talking to each other swiftly. They start enjoying this and become happy. A person named McCaffrey is searching Dan's house with his underlings, but they don't get any information on Dan nor his family. McCaffrey tells his men strictly to find Dan and his whole family as quickly as possible. Dan arrives at a motel with his family, and Kyle meets his friend outside the motel. She knew Kyle from his gaming life. She uploads a selfie of Kyle on her socials. Dan sees this and understands what's coming up next. He immediately takes his family away from there. Suddenly, a group of people started pursuing Dan's car while his family was sleeping. Dan uses this opportunity to take down the pursuers one by one. But due to a crash noise, Jessica wakes up from her sleep, but Dan handles it somehow. In the morning, Dan stops the car and sleeps right inside it. Nina wakes up from sleep and, after looking out, she understands that they've come to the countryside. She excitedly tells her parents that she wants to study at Southern Loba University around that place. Dan then takes everyone to Southern Loba University. While Dan is having a walk on the university campus with his family, Nina tells Kyle about her boyfriend. Kyle listens to Nina curiously and then gives her advice. Hearing it, Nina feels joy that her younger brother understands her. They both are talking to each other properly for the first time. Then we see Jessica telling Dan that she used to be an athlete during her college time, but after getting married, she forgot all that due to her busyness in the family. Dan thinks of telling Jessica about his past, but before that, he spots a German man who is talking to someone on the phone while holding a briefcase. Dan suspects him, so he walks close to that man. After talking a little, Dan understands that person is just a businessman. The person tells Dan that he came here from Germany to look for his daughter. Dan suspects him hearing this, so he starts talking to him in German. Jessica gets shocked hearing this and walks away. But when Dan makes the person open his briefcase, there were several bean boxes inside it. Dan understands he isn't stalking him. Suddenly, a person shoots at Dan. Dan and that person engage in a fight, and Dan defeats him before coming out of there. After this, we see Nina going to her boyfriend's room. As soon as his boyfriend opens the door, Nina sees another girl inside his room. They both were making out, and Nina gets heartbroken with this. Nina breaks up with her boyfriend and starts crying back in her car. Dan asks Nina what's wrong. She tells him everything. Dan reminds Nina how he had taught her to teach such people a lesson. He forces her to go back to him. Nina comes back to her boyfriend and beats him well. Nina feels very good with this and forgets all her pain she got from getting cheated. Dan then tells Nina to join the martial arts community right after returning back home. Nina agrees to it and thanks her father. She hasn't told anything to her mother. After a little while, Dan and his family reach Las Vegas. Dan calls his friend Augie. Dan tells Augie to make fake passports for his family so no one can trace Dan. When Dan is waiting for Augie in the cafe, Kyle comes to him. Dan asks Kyle why he chose to become a gamer. Kyle then tells Dan that he doesn't like the real world. He likes the gaming world more, and he is very good in games. As well, playing games is not a very easy thing. You need a sharp brain for it. He gives a challenge to Dan, on which he agrees. Kyle then goes to play a game with Dan. But Dan easily defeats Kyle because he used to be a professional assassin. Kyle gets sad after getting defeated, but Dan hugs him to make things better. Then Dan and his family check in at another hotel. Here, he meets Augie and gives him money to take passports and weapons, after which he tells his children that he'll take Jessica to dinner at night, but after they go to dinner, Kyle and Nina will stay inside the room no matter what happens. But Kyle and Nina leave the house with Max. A person spots Dan and Jessica while they are going to dinner. Kyle then meets a professional gamer named Ren. He introduces Kyle to his team. On the other side, Dan reveals everything to Jessica about his past. Jessica gets shocked. Ren tells Kyle that he can play in his place. Kyle starts playing while Ren tries to flirt with Nina. Right then, Jessica and Dan come back to the house to check up on the kids. McCaffrey's men again attack them. Dan kills 2 of them, but the third one gets his hands on Jessica. Dan manipulates him and mischievously stabs his eye with a knife. Then Dan and Jessica immediately go out to look for their kids. We see that Kyle has won the challenge. Dan and Jessica arrive there, and while they take their 3 kids out from there, Dan tells his children that he used to be an assailant and he left everything later on because he started a normal life with Jessica. But now his past is coming back to kill him. Kyle and Nina think of this as a joke and start laughing. Right then, shooting starts, and Dan hides everyone under the table and leaves to stop the gangsters. Dan shoots at them but notices that everyone was wearing bulletproof jackets. He somehow manages to take his family out of that place. Now at a hotel, Dan tells his family that his real name is Sam. He used to work for the military, and there he met McCaffrey. He created a new group to kill high-ranking criminals. He slowly started massacring all of them, but as time passed, Dan understood that McCaffrey was just using Dan for his work, so he leaves the group. Kyle and Nina get disappointed hearing this and say that he ruined their lives. In the room, Jessica tells Gwen to plan a trip for her family so they can leave immediately. They arrive at Gwen's location, where she brought a private plane for them. They get boarded on the plane. Gwen tells Jessica about her ex-boyfriend, but after a little while, Jessica understands she is talking about Dan. Right then, McCaffrey appears in front of them. Here, we are exposed to a deal that Gwen will hand over Dan's family to McCaffrey, and McCaffrey will give Dan to Gwen. Then, as McCaffrey is taking Jessica to his location, he tells Dan to arrive there or else he'll kill his whole family. Dan quickly arrives at the location. McCaffrey tells Dan to expose his relation to everyone. Then McCaffrey tells everyone that Dan is his son and he is disappointed in him. He tells Dan to come back to his previous life, but Dan declines this offer. McCaffrey tells Gwen to kill Dan's family if he does not agree with him. Dan somehow says yes due to pressure and also tells McCaffrey to send his family out of there safe and sound. Dan's family was not ready to let Dan go away easily. Jessica throws a guard down. We see Gwen getting close to Dan, but Dan makes Jessica pass out. Dan's family comes there too. McCaffrey understands that there's something wrong going on. Dan tells Kyle to use the drone to know everyone's location. Dan plants bombs using this information. After some men are defeated with explosions, Dan defeats others on his own. Meanwhile, Gwen wakes up and tells everything to McCaffrey. Dan reaches McCaffrey, and while holding his gun towards his father, he tells him to stop everything. But McCaffrey doesn't listen to him. On the other side, Jessica kills Gwen, and as McCaffrey is about to kill Dan, Nina stops him. Dan uses this opportunity to defeat McCaffrey. Now we see everything getting back to normal. Nina became a reporter. Dan opened his security company. Jessica became a coach, and then they again enjoy a road trip together without phones.